All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, so here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here, and very excited to have as my guest today, Nick Arnett. Nick, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
All right. So Nick is author of the Stress Management and Crisis Response Pocket Guide, as well as the upcoming book, Stress into Strength, Resilience Routines for Warriors, Wimps, and Everyone in Between. He's a critical incident stress management and resilience leader and instructor, a fire chaplain, wildland firefighter with the Spring Valley Fire Department and the U.S. Forest Service, and former paramedic with experience in domestic and international disaster response in medical communities, crisis intervention, and chaplain roles. To describe the book, there's a kind of blurb here that I'd like to read because I think it's pretty interesting. It said that this is not another, quote, how to lower your stress site. It's not about avoiding stress or how to get over or move on from trauma or grief. It's about performing your best while challenged. It's an invitation to seek balance and connections rather than one-dimensional fixes. If we grimly regard an experience as a horror to be buried and forgotten, we'll never find or make meaning. If we ignore trauma and pretend that life is all unicorns and sunshine, we'll discover sooner or later that our brains, bodies, and souls are holding onto the pain anyway. Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. And if I could just clarify, the book Stress into Strength is out.
Okay.
It's in worldwide distribution, pretty much any bookstore or online bookseller.
Awesome.
Print and ebook and audio.
Perfect. We'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at thetraumatherapistpodcast.com. Before we get going, Nick, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
So I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's where I first became a paramedic. And then a few years after that, finished college, moved out here to Santa Clara, California, where I live now. Although during fire season, you can find me pretty much anywhere in, especially the Western United States.
Okay. So let's get into it here. How the heck did you get into this field?
Through a very difficult experience, like so many people I meet who works in especially peer support and critical incident stress management and public safety. Our niece's husband was a U.S. Marine who was killed in action on November 10th, 2004 in Fallujah, Iraq, which happens to be the Marine Corps birthday, as any Marine knows. Which means I always know where to find Marines on the anniversary of the day he died. That I had been out of public safety for a while doing journalism and market research and starting software companies in the intelligence area. But when Wes was killed, what I think it did was made me realize I was carrying around a lot of old baggage. So I actually reached out to our Bay Area critical incident stress management team for help. And they absolutely were helpful and then invited me to join the team. So that was 18 years ago, and now I've probably done over 1,000 crisis interventions. I've become an instructor and write books about it.
Can you say more? What do you mean when he was killed, you realized that maybe you were carrying more baggage? Say more about that. My most vivid memory of Wes, I actually never spent much time around him, but the night before the wedding, he had already served one tour in Iraq and clearly had been through some very, very difficult stuff. And I have this just crystal clear memory of sitting with him at the rehearsal dinner in a restaurant at a booth and just looking him in the eyes and telling him that although I will never know, I hope I'll never know what it's like to go through combat, that I certainly understand what it's like to be in a situation that's extremely chaotic, where lives are at stake, and your job is to be the one who gets it under control, but you can't sometimes. And basically just wanted to let them know, hey, even though I can't pretend to understand combat, I have an idea of how difficult that sense of everything being out of control and helplessness when the stakes are enormous is. And we just sat there looking each other in the eye for a while. That was actually the last time I ever talked to him, because they got married. He got a month later, I think he got, or no, it was, I don't remember the timing, but anyway, never saw him again. And I think just one thing I think it did is it kind of mirrored a friend of mine who was a firefighter who was killed in a house fire when I was actually his age, Wes's age, so early 20s. And he was actually a little younger than me. I think I was 22, he was 19, and killed in this fire. And I think when you're 22, you have no idea really how to grieve, especially something like a line of duty death. So to this day, I still sort of am uncertain if I've ever really processed, or whatever the right word is, the death of my friend John from, this was 1982, I think. And I think Wes dying, being killed in action, brought that all up again, and just the topic of war, for John, there's a memorial plaque to John that has, I think it's actually John 3:6. No, that's a quote from the Bible. And right now I can't think of what the verse is, but greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. That was the central theme of John's funeral back in 1982. And then it became something that I needed to wrestle with a lot, I think, after Wes was killed. During my career in software, I actually was involved in developing intelligence systems, including the one for some systems for the White House Situation Room. And those systems were intended to assure that the president's daily briefing was objective. And one of the things I learned about the run-up to the war in Iraq is that whole system of ensuring objectivity was dismantled. And so I had pretty strong feelings about the war. And I guess more than anything else, I realized that I could get lost in self-righteousness and outrage very easily after Wes was killed. And I decided that was not going to be good for me or the world. So I could probably talk all day without really ever naming all of the things that Wes's death brought up for me. But my life certainly was never the same. My priorities shifted, and I ended up on this path that not only took me into peer support and crisis intervention for public safety, but back into actually doing public safety for a living.
Okay. I appreciate you sharing that. What was it about public safety that attracted you, that pulled you?
Well, the statement that resonates the best with me is that we have a tendency to become the person who was missing in our childhood. And I can look back at my childhood, remembering times so my dad had a violent temper. I realize now my parents were very emotionally neglectful. And I had a strong sense that something was wrong, something was missing growing up. And I absolutely longed for someone to come rescue me. And I think, not to trivialize, or oversimplify, but I do feel like to a certain extent, I am becoming the person that I wish was there in my life when I was young. And just that mission of bringing order out of chaos is appealing. And I think that's partly because I don't sleep well. And that mimics ADHD sometimes, and whether I really have ADHD or it's just sleep apnea and sort of the effects of that. I have, pardon me, that's my fire department with a call, which I'm not going to respond to. I think I silenced it. It is sort of an annoying thing to fully silence. So, I enjoy the adrenaline. Getting paged in the middle of an interview. One of those adrenaline things.
Excuse me. So let's, if we can, describe what a critical incident is and what is needed. And I realize everything is unique, but sure, in terms of trying to get a picture here for our listeners, what is needed to bring order, quote unquote, order to the chaos?
So one of the things I teach in every class is that we should never, ever respond with crisis intervention under the assumption that something is traumatic. I'll actually put up a slide that says there's no such thing as a traumatic incident, which is just to get people thinking, because that's a bizarre statement if you do what I do or what you do. And then the next slide says, we respond based on people's reactions, not what happened. So and I tell the story of I think it's an EMT here in Silicon Valley who assured me that she was perfectly okay doing CPR on babies. And most are not. Most of us really struggle with running a code on a baby. But she's a great example of how, what might be traumatic for me is not, apparently, we have to take people at their word, not traumatic for her. And she's run lots of codes on babies, and she seems to be doing okay. So a traumatic incident, the definition we work with in terms of responding is incidents that provoke very strong emotional reactions from the people involved. And involved can mean a lot of things, from directly involved to actually us as we hear those stories. Secondary vicarious trauma is absolutely real. We need support ourselves. And the other big thing I teach is I teach people to say what I say to people when I meet them after a critical incident, which is, I'm not here to fix this or make it better. And that's as much a reminder to me to shut down my codependence, because and the public safety action-oriented problem-solving personality, because they don't need, if it's a critical incident, it can't be fixed. Somebody has died or something equally horrible that there's no do-overs. What I say is our job really is to create the safe place for people to have the difficult feelings, because the only way to get rid of bad feelings is to have them. And I like to compare that to what Shrek says about farting: better out than in. So fundamentally, I think people need that safe place to go ahead and have the feelings, but they also need their sense of control restored. So when I teach people how to do, whether it's psychological aid or debriefings, defusings, whatever, that people have to have permission not to speak, because everybody needs that. Everybody has the right to decide right. What and when and where to talk about things. Although I think by giving people permission, we sort of signal, you have control. And I think people actually talk more when we give them permission. And the other big thing that I think people need is to hear the words "me too." I think "me too" is incredibly powerful. That the stress autopilot, the amygdala and the limbic system don't like isolation. Mm-hmm. There's something incredibly powerful. And I tell people this right after I give them permission not to speak. I'll say, however, if you name a thought or a feeling that someone else in this room has, you just help them, whether they are saying anything or not. So, put that little bit of pressure on people, inviting them to go ahead and talk about it. Another way to answer that question is, I think people need our curiosity, and specifically not the curiosity about what happened, but the curiosity about how was it for you to go through that. And again, that's addressing isolation, restoring the sense of control, ending the isolation, and then more long-term sort of acknowledging and normalizing reactions, just so that people don't feel like they're going crazy, and giving them ideas of what's supportive in the long run, and setting the example of that.
Okay, so I think that was a good general overview. Can you get specific and share an experience you had and what this might have looked like?
Yeah, I'm a little overwhelmed by the number of experiences. Plus, I always have to be careful about confidentiality.
Of course.
So I mean, sometimes these things can be so confusing to people. I do have my best friend's permission to talk about an incident he was involved in, where it was a Boy Scout event, and he got sent up to a zipline tower as the person who was clipping people into harnesses and so forth, and doing those safety checks, and they didn't train him properly. Someone wanted to go to lunch early, and his name's Dave, and I actually taught Dave technical climbing, so using ropes and so forth. So he had some background for this, but he had one of the parents who was a big guy, like 280 pounds, who chose to do the zip line Superman style, meaning instead of clipping in from the front, clip in from the back. So Dave clipped him in, not realizing what he was clipping him into was a loop on the harness that was just for hanging the harness up on the wall and couldn't handle the weight. And the guy leaped off the platform and the harness broke. And Dave's now looking at, this guy who he thinks, he said the first thought that came to his mind was, I just killed somebody. The man survived. And I will check in with Dave every now and then on how he's doing with that. And so a year or two later, I was asking him, one of the questions we use a lot is, what's hardest for you right now? So even 2 years later, what's the hardest thing for this right now? And what he said was, the hardest part of it in the long run was that there were no consequences. And in my training with Dr. George Everly, who was one of the founders of the Critical Incident Stress Foundation, which set our standards for how we do this, Dr. Everly really emphasized that when things are unpredictable, we can find that very stressful. And so I was able to reassure Dave that, yeah, that is a natural or normal response to this very abnormal event, because that stress autopilot part of the brain, the monkey mind, wants things to be predictable. And predictable would have been, if you almost kill somebody, you should be punished for it. Mm-hmm. And yet, he said the worst thing that happened to him was that the lawyers for this guy, the fellow sued the Boy Scouts and everybody else, and the Boy Scouts settled. But Dave said, the worst thing that happened to me was they showed me a picture of myself standing on top of the zipline tower, and I looked fat, and I didn't like the way I looked. But that was the worst thing that happened to me after I almost killed somebody. And so reassuring people that their responses are natural and normal, and acknowledging really whatever, especially for the first 30 days, aside from people feeling homicidal or suicidal, we pretty much can reassure them that whatever thoughts, feelings, and so forth they're having, we reassure them that this is at least natural, if not normal. We avoid the word normal too much because life can seem very, very abnormal. Another example is just a very quick one. We had a mass shooting here at a Ford dealership, and one of the employees had run outside and then staying there. He was telling us, I wanted to run back in to help people. And I always thought I was the kind of person who would do that, but I was frozen. I could not physically move. And, reassured him that we have this fight, flight, freeze response that sometimes we have no voluntary control over, and just reassuring him without trying to tell him not to feel guilty, but actually acknowledging, yeah, it's unsurprising that you feel guilty, because we would all want to do that, especially if we think that that's the kind of person we are. So just a lot of, acknowledgement, reassurance that people aren't going crazy, and helping them support one another down the road. We come in for an hour or two, maybe a bit more for big events, but in the end, it's people's own social support network. And especially we'll tell them you're each other's best support. The people you went through this critical incident together with can be your best support, because unlike everybody else in the world, including me, they understand. They really can understand what it was like to go through that particular event.
When you're working with a critical incident that involves multiple people, what is required there? What is required in terms of steps, processes, triaging? How do you put into place a protocol to ease or create safety or regulation?
So we have an expanding, we think of it as an expanding circle, and we'll try to start with the people directly involved. So those are the folks who are hands-on, and we keep roles separate. If it's the public, we do things somewhat differently than if it's the responders, especially responders who were operating as a team before the incident and need to continue to operate as a team afterwards. Very different from people from the public who may not have even known each other before they went through something. So we start with those closest, and then we kind of expand outward, and try to keep people who had similar experiences together, not mixing directly affected and indirectly affected people, and so forth. And then the big difference with people who were teams before and after is and this is misunderstood a lot, even within public safety, the word debriefing. So the word debriefing sometimes gets incorrectly used to refer to a one-on-one interaction, and that's never a debriefing. In fact, the research on all this can be very confusing, because a lot of times the research papers don't identify what protocol they were actually using. And so sometimes they'll talk about psychological debriefings, and if they're talking about one-on-one interactions, we know that the research is flawed because there's no such thing. So we use psychological first aid techniques with individuals and with groups who are not a team. With teams, we have these very specific interventions called defusings, which we do in the immediate aftermath, and then debriefings, which we like to do 24 to 48 hours later. But those are really oriented toward a group of people who were a team before and are going to be a team after. And critical incident stress management in general is described as a continuum of care that ranges from sort of all the pre-incident preparation of, how are we going to train people, deploy them, and so forth, through these individual group interactions, people who specialize in families, the spiritual role, and then clinicians, and ultimately, inpatient psychotherapy. And something I didn't hear enough of it when I first got involved in this that I really emphasize when I teach people now is the importance of referrals. At every level of it, it's critically important that we know, when do we need to refer this person to a higher level of care? Mm-hmm. That's like the EMT out on the fire line who's looking at a firefighter who's got a laceration, knowing the criteria for whether they need to go to a clinic and see a doctor, or they can be just treated and, stay out in the field. It's very much the same kind of thing.
Can you share, you've been doing this for how long?
18 years.
Okay. Can you share maybe an error you made early on?
Well, I think failing to be very aware of referrals, as I just mentioned, that was not I think when I started getting training from people like George Everly and Jeff Mitchell, who were the founders of the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, I think they really pounded into students the importance of being very aware of when to refer. And I don't know that I'd totally call it an error, but I think to be able to do this more than a few years without burning out, you need to let go of responsibility for the outcome. And that has a very interesting effect, because when you look at your job as just create the safe place and whatever happens, you become a witness to healing rather than all this responsibility of imagining you're the one who makes the healing happen. Mm-hmm. It's so much more about creating the environment for that healing to take place, and that ends up being fairly freeing. And I really don't think if I hadn't figured out how to let go of that attitude after 3 or 4 years, I would have walked away and just would not have been able to cope myself with just.
What's very interesting about what you're describing here is, as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, how does it compare to just therapy, psychotherapy, one-on-one therapy, right? A lot of what you're saying overlaps. But also, we're talking about critical incident, right? So something has happened, a critical incident has happened, and you're going in to, or one is going in to really create a safe space or a place where people can feel hopefully regulated. And you're saying, you have to kind of let go of the outcome. That's hard. I don't understand that so much. In therapy, I could understand that, but it seems like someone like yourself, you have a very definite job, right? And it's like, it's almost binary in the sense, well, either this space was created or it wasn't created. What's your response?
I think it's more a question of letting it happen versus trying to make it happen.
Okay.
I think it was Henry Nouwen who once said that, we're sometimes at our worst when we try and make a difference. And I think a lot of that revolves around the word acceptance. I was in some suicide intervention training, probably the fourth such class I've taken last weekend, or the weekend before last. And there was a video, and this was a simulation. It was actors sitting in stunned silence after their classmate had killed himself, died by suicide. And it kind of got to me because I've been in that situation so many times. And it was a reminder to me, as much as I try not to be attached to the outcome, and as much as I try not to take responsibility for what happens, to do the work, we do have to shut down our reactions a bit, or maybe a lot. But I guess what I've noticed is that most of the time I can walk away and my brain won't keep sort of going over it the way it does after an operational error. If I do something wrong as an EMT or as a firefighter, my brain will replay. Do better next time. The times that happens during these critical incident stress debriefings, it's usually where it can fool me, where it can really sneak up on me, is when I'm identifying with somebody subconsciously because they resemble me in a way that I'm not proud of, if that makes sense. And I mean, just to clarify it, I have to be pretty vague here just for confidentiality, but we had a couple of teenage boys who did something terrible. And I sat down with one of them and talked to him for a couple hours soon afterwards, and it was just sticking with me. And it wasn't until a few days later that finally the light bulb went off, that their motivation for doing this terrible thing was that they felt like their parents didn't accept them for who they were. And it's like, oh goodness, that's very familiar to me. And then my brain kind of let go of it, and I could move along and not have it sort of bothering me. But part of the challenge, I think, in doing anything like this is just to notice when that's happening, because some of those things, like, as I rode Stress into Strength, I realized that the power of noticing is where all of this healing and change come from, because you really can't deal with something until you notice it's there. And we have an astonishing ability to, not notice what our body's doing, not notice what our mind is doing, not notice what's happening to our values and priorities. And you asked about critical incident stress management versus therapy. I'm not sure there's a bright line, but metaphorically, I think if you're a clinician, you're a little more like a surgeon, in that you can deliberately open up a wound in your office because you know how to close it before the person goes home.
Hopefully and theoretically.
Yeah. That's beyond my skill set. I mean, in reality, for some limited set of circumstances, I probably could do fine, but I'm not prepared for anything. So, and this is what I teach my students. And so I'll say, never push, poke, or prod. Make everything an invitation. Invite. The only exception to that is when the person's in immediate physical danger, and then take control and resolve that. But I think well-meaning people will say things like, you need to talk about this. And while it's true that talking can help, again, it's got to be when people choose and with whom they choose. And especially when they're feeling any guilt or shame about what happened, it can be so difficult to talk, and they really need permission to not talk and to choose who, what, when, and where.
Who is the book for? So we're talking about Stress into Strength, Resilience, Routine for Warriors, Wimps, and Everyone in Between.
Well, I violated a fundamental principle of marketing and writing books. It's kind of for everybody.
Okay.
Which is really not the way they say, not the way to sell books. And having been in business, I know that we always want to pick a target market and write just to that. But that subtitle, Warriors, Wimps, and Everybody in Between, it is a pretty broad-ranging book, and I was kind of amazed that HarperCollins Leadership picked it up anyway.
But I think they're hoping, as I do, that it becomes kind of an evergreen title that just will continue to sell for a long time. I mean, that's where book publishers make their money, is this, and that's what I want for when I eventually actually retire. I'd like to have written some books that have their own momentum going. And another reason I think the book is a general audience book is, as I wrote it, I realized that our culture used to have a lot of the sources of resilience built in. Even 50 years ago, we had a lot more of the things that make us resilient just built into the way we lived. And we need to be very intentional about restoring those.
What are you talking about? Like the family dynamic, or for example, or?
So I talk in the book a lot about stress disconnects and renewal reconnects. And I guess, so one thing we really have going against us is the myth of toxic stress. And I call it a myth because I don't know if you're familiar with the University of Wisconsin study where they looked at 30,000 US adults and their attitudes towards stress and their stress levels. These people had filled out a survey 8 years earlier, and the researchers went back and looked up public records to see who lived and who died. And as you might expect, the people who reported really high levels of stress, either medium or high stress, who believed that stress is toxic to your health, quickest to die. But the people who reported the very highest levels of stress, who didn't believe that stress is toxic, lived the longest. And unfortunately, we could thank in part the tobacco companies for that, by funding some of the original research into stress and stress hormones and so forth to sell cigarettes as a way to relieve stress, promoting the idea that stress will kill you. And then as it became clear that tobacco was causing the heart disease and so forth, they used that research to say, no, the tobacco's not causing it. It's the stress, and people are smoking to relieve the stress. So that idea kind of got ingrained. So we're up against that. And then diet and exercise are absolutely big ones, but social support in general, I think, is dramatically different. People used to live and work in the same communities. Their kids used to go to the same schools. We have so much more freedom to commute and transport people that the number of people reporting they have no close friends is really scary. And sleep. There's a wonderful new book that came out a year or two ago called Why We Sleep, that summarizes a lot of what's been learned in the last 10 years about how critically important sleep is. And yet so many people in Western culture especially just aren't getting enough sleep at night. I finished that book and thought, wow, if people would just get enough sleep, so many of our health and behavioral problems would go away. And learning in my 30s that I had either mild or severe sleep apnea, depending on who's testing me, was an eye-opener for me to understand how that put me at risk for post-traumatic stress disorder and just a lot of other health and other issues. So I actually look at stress and and I should say something about the word renewal. So I was looking at stress in physical, social, and spiritual dimensions, and the social dimension. One of the insights I had there was that has everything to do with our ability to think clearly and self-regulate emotions. And then when I say spiritual, I'm talking about a sense of meaning and purpose and values, priorities, and so forth, above and beyond just self-interest. And I realized that it is the combination of those stresses with renewal, physical, social, and spiritual renewal, that builds strength. Just like going to the gym, you stress your muscles by lifting weights. You do it at the right rhythm and interval and amounts and so forth. And it's going to be peculiar to you. You need to figure out what you need because everybody's a little different. But then you also need the physical renewal, which sports medicine calls recovery. But I didn't want to use that word because you get outside of sports and that sounds like we're talking about addiction and recovery. So that wasn't the right word. But you got to get your protein, your sleep, your rest, and so forth. And then your muscles grow, or at least you maintain your strength, your physical strength. And I, through reading, especially Brene Brown, I kind of realized that those friendships, having people we can get real with, I think we have that really deep need
to have people in our, and I think COVID taught us we really need diversity in that social support of people we can just be real with. And I realized that's kind of like going to the gym for the brain, but we're not getting a lot of it. And social media is almost the opposite because it's self-promotional. It's not real. And you know, I warn people, don't compare yourself to what you're seeing people post on social media because they really pretty much only post the good stuff. And then on the spiritual side, I realized, you know, we lose perspective, and the spiritual renewal is to get that perspective back. So my friend Dave, the same guy I was talking about before, he's my closest friend, so I have permission to talk about his difficult stuff. He lost a 2-year-old to a brain tumor many years ago. It's been more than 20 years now. And I've talked to him about, you know, what's that like now? And he says it's bittersweet. You know, it was horrible to see a 2-year-old suffer and then die. But it was wonderful the way the community came around them, and things like that lead us to change and it has for Dave and his wife. It changed their perspective for the good. It changed their priorities. And I certainly have experienced that too. I mean, when Wes was killed in action in Iraq, it ended up really shifting my priorities tremendously in a very good way. And so I think to activate the spiritual renewal, we need, you know, they call it pause and plan, stop. And, you know, so contemplative practices in general help us get rid of the tunnel vision that stress gives us and restore the perspective. So the book is really about looking at those 3 dimensions of stress and renewal, and what do they look like? What does it mean to regularly experience the right amounts and kinds of stress and renewal at the right rhythms, the right intervals, and so forth. And by the way, I steered away completely from trauma, except for one paragraph in the back that basically says, hey, if these kinds of things are going on in your life, that could be trauma, and go to, you know, find a clinician. Again, sort of sticking to, you know, staying in my lane, as we say in the fire service, the guy who knows a few things but is not a clinician.
So the name of the book again here as we wind down is Stress into Strength, Resilience Routine for Warriors, Wimps, and Everyone in Between. Nick, what is the best way for people to get in contact with you and to perhaps learn more about you?
So I do have a website, nickarnett.net, just like my name. I don't update it terribly often. I do have an Amazon author page. I'm on Facebook as Stress into Strength, and Twitter under my name, Nick Arnett. Okay. I do have an Amazon author page, which has information about all of my books. There's 4 of them.
Awesome. All right, Nick, fascinating. And you're one fascinating individual. I really appreciate you coming on here.
Thank you.
All right, sir, we'll be in touch. Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.